The Druids, priests, philosophers, and the keepers of an ancient world. They left no writing, no temples, no monuments they claimed as their own. Everything we know about them comes from their enemies, and yet, for over 1,000 years, the Druids were the most powerful intellectual class in Europe. Judges, doctors, astronomers, philosophers, and keepers of knowledge so vast it took 20 years of unbroken study to master. When Julius Caesar tried to conquer Gaul, he didn't just fight Celtic warriors. He fought the Druids who organized resistance, predicted outcomes, and held communities together through the power of sacred authority. When Rome finally destroyed them, it burned down an entire civilization's memory. So who were the Druids really? What did they know? And why does the world they built still haunt our imagination 2,000 years later? The word Druid has been with us for over 2,000 years, and in that time it has accumulated layers of meaning, mythology, and misunderstanding that make recovering its original significance a genuine challenge. The most widely accepted etymology connects the first element of the word to the Proto-Celtic root for oak, the same root that gives us the Latin word for wood, drus, and the second element to a root meaning to know or to see. A druid on this reading was one who knows the oak, or one who sees deeply, a name that captured both the natural setting of druidical practice and the claim to a special kind of knowledge that defined the druid's social role. The oak was not chosen arbitrarily as the central symbol of druidical practice. In the forests of Western and Central Europe, the oak was the dominant tree of the mature woodland, the species that grew largest, lived longest, and created the deep shade beneath which the forest ecosystem developed. Ancient oaks measured in centuries rather than decades, and their scale and longevity gave them a quality of sacred permanence in a world where most living things were brief and fragile. The oak produced acorns that fed both humans and animals. Its wood was the strongest and most durable available. Its bark contained medicinal compounds. The mistletoe that grew on oak trees, a relatively rare occurrence, was understood as a gift of the divine, a plant that had chosen the most sacred tree as its host, and its harvesting became one of the signature ritual acts associated with the Druids. The sacred grove, the nematon in the Celtic languages, a word that appears in place names across the entire Celtic world from Anatolia to Britain, was the primary sacred space of Celtic religious practice. Unlike the temples of the Mediterranean world, which were built structures designed to house the divine presence in a specific architectural form, the Celtic sacred space was a natural one, a clearing in the forest, a grove of old oaks, a place where the forest opened to let in the sky. The nematon was not constructed but recognized, identified as a place where the boundary between the human world and the divine world was already thin, where the sacred quality of the natural world was concentrated by topographic features, old growth, or long tradition. The Druids who presided over these sacred groves were not an ancient institution from the beginning of human time in Europe. The Druidic order, as a recognizable social institution, appears to have developed in the first millennium BCE, probably in the context of the Hallstatt and early Latin Celtic cultures of Central Europe, and to have spread with the Celtic cultural expansion that carried Celtic languages and practices across the continent. The precise time and place of the Druids' emergence is impossible to identify with certainty because the Druids themselves left no written records. This was a deliberate choice, as we will discuss, and the earliest descriptions of them from outside observers date to the 2nd century BCE at the earliest. What is clear from the archaeological and textual evidence is that by the time Celtic civilization reached its greatest geographic extent, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Druidic order was a well-established and sophisticated institution with a clear internal structure, recognized social functions, and a consistent set of practices that were recognizable across the entire Celtic world. A Druid from Gaul attending the great annual assembly of Druids in central France would have shared enough common ground in knowledge, ritual practice, and institutional structure with Druids from Britain or Ireland to participate meaningfully in the same religious and intellectual community. This cultural consistency, maintained across enormous geographic distances without written texts or centralized institutional authority, is itself a remarkable testimony to the organizational effectiveness of the Druidic tradition. The forests in which the Druids worked were not simply a backdrop to their activities. They were the essential environment in which the Druidical worldview made sense. The Celtic understanding of the natural world as a system of interconnected living forces, each with its own spiritual character, all participating in patterns of cyclical change that the trained observer could learn to read, was a philosophy of nature that could only be properly developed and transmitted in the presence of nature itself. The forest was not a resource to be exploited, but a community of beings to be understood and respected. And the Druid, who knew the oak grove in which he had studied for decades, knew something about the world that could not be acquired from texts. This understanding of the forest as teacher and the grove as classroom was not sentimental. It was epistemological, a claim about how genuine knowledge of certain subjects, the behavior of the natural world, the movements of seasons and weather, the signs by which divine intention could be read in natural events, could only be acquired through sustained, attentive presence in the environment where those subjects manifested. The 20 years that Druidical education required were not 20 years of sitting in a grove memorizing abstract propositions. They were 20 years of learning to read a living text, the forest, the sky, the water, the behavior of animals, and the growth of plants, alongside the oral transmission of the accumulated human understanding of what that text meant. When Julius Caesar described the Druids of Gaul in his account of the Gallic Wars, one detail above all others struck him as remarkable: the length of Druidical education. He reports that Druids in training might spend 20 years memorizing the vast body of knowledge that constituted Druidical learning, and that all of this memorization was done through oral repetition rather than written text. 20 years, an entire generation. A person who began Druidical training in adolescence would not complete it until they were in their 30s. The commitment of time and intellectual effort that this implies was extraordinary even by the standards of ancient intellectual traditions, and it speaks to the scope and depth of what the Druids were expected to know. The decision to transmit Druidical knowledge exclusively through oral means was not a limitation of Druidical capability. Caesar specifically notes that the Druids were not ignorant of writing. They used the Greek alphabet for practical purposes in their communities. The choice to keep sacred knowledge oral was a deliberate philosophical position, and the reasoning behind it, as Caesar and other ancient sources report it, reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between knowledge, memory, and understanding. Writing, the Druids argued, creates the illusion of knowledge. A person who has read something in a text believes they know it, but they have not done the work of truly internalizing it that sustained memorization requires. The knowledge that lives in the memory, that has been repeated until it is as automatic as breathing, is knowledge that has been genuinely possessed. The knowledge that lives in a text is merely stored, available to be retrieved, but not truly integrated into the knower's understanding. There is also a practical element to the choice of oral transmission. Knowledge that exists only in the memories of trained individuals cannot be seized, stolen, or read by the enemy. The Roman armies that conquered Gaul could burn Celtic settlements, confiscate Celtic property, and kill Celtic warriors. They could not raid the memory of a Druid who had spent 20 years learning to remember. The oral tradition was, in this sense, the ultimate encrypted archive, secure in a way that no written text could ever be, precisely because it required years of dedicated work to access. The internal structure of the Druidical order was hierarchical, clear divisions between different grades of specialists. The most commonly cited division distinguishes three main classes: the Druids proper, who were the religious and philosophical specialists responsible for ritual, theology, and the resolution of legal and political disputes; the Vates, or Ovates, who specialized in divination, sacrifice, and the interpretation of natural signs; and the Bards, who were the poets and musicians responsible for preserving and transmitting history, genealogy, and the community's collective memory through song and verse. These three classes represented different aspects of the overall function of the Druidic order, and while they were distinct in role, they were part of a unified intellectual tradition. The Druids proper, the highest rank of the order, were individuals of enormous social authority. Caesar describes them as occupying a position of honor superior to the warrior nobility. They were exempt from military service, they paid no taxes, and they could move freely between warring tribes without being subject to the violence that the absence of their protection would have brought on any other traveler. Their authority derived not from military power, but from the recognition of their learning and their role as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. In a society where the divine was understood as constantly present and constantly capable of intervening in human affairs, the specialists who could communicate with that divine presence and interpret its intentions were indispensable. More indispensable in the long run than even the most skilled warriors. The Druid who achieved the highest levels of the order's learning was a figure of remarkable intellectual breadth. Caesar and other ancient sources enumerate the subjects of Druidical study: the nature of the gods and the divine world, the movements of the stars and planets and their significance for human affairs, the nature of the physical world and the principles that governed it, the history and genealogy of the Celtic tribes and their connections to the divine, the laws and customs of Celtic society and the principles by which disputes should be resolved, the properties of plants and their medicinal applications, the techniques of divination and the interpretation of natural signs. This is a curriculum that would be impressive at any level of civilization, and its preservation through oral transmission alone was an intellectual achievement of the first order. The most remarkable element of Druidical theology, the feature that attracted the attention of ancient observers from Caesar to the Greek geographer Strabo to the philosopher Posidonius, was the doctrine of the immortality and transmigration of the soul. The Druids taught, and apparently their followers deeply believed, that the soul does not die with the body, but passes at death into another body, to be born again into a new life. This teaching was not a vague comfort about spiritual survival, but a specific philosophical position about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical body. A position that ancient observers found sophisticated enough to compare with the teachings of Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher who had held similar views about the soul's journey through multiple lives. The consequences of this belief for Celtic attitudes toward death and warfare were noted repeatedly by ancient observers. The Celts, they reported, faced death in battle with a courage that bordered on recklessness. Not because they were incapable of fear, but because they did not regard death as the termination of their existence. If the soul passed at death into another body, and if the next life preserved some continuity with the present one, if courage was rewarded and cowardice punished in the distribution of rebirths, then dying bravely in battle was not a catastrophe but a transition, possibly even a promotion. The Druidical doctrine of transmigration was thus not merely a philosophical position, but a practical military asset. And the Romans, who suppressed the Druids, understood that eliminating the Druidical teaching was part of the work of breaking Celtic military resistance. The ritual life that the Druids oversaw was organized around the Celtic calendar, a system of seasonal divisions that marked the passage of the year through its phases of growth, harvest, decay, and renewal. The four great festivals of the Celtic year, Samhain at the beginning of November, Imbolc at the beginning of February, Beltane at the beginning of May, and Lunasa at the beginning of August, were not merely agricultural markers, but sacred occasions when the boundary between the human world and the divine world was understood to be particularly thin, and the presence of divine powers particularly intense. Samhain was the most sacred and most spiritually charged of the four festivals, the moment when the veil between the living and the dead was at its most permeable, when the ancestors could return to visit the living, when spirits moved freely through the world. The fires lit on Samhain were not merely celebratory, but protective and purifying. They marked the boundary of the community and kept the dangerous supernatural forces of the dark half of the year at bay. The practices associated with Samhain, the special foods, the disguises that allowed humans to move among supernatural beings without being recognized, the hospitality extended to wanderers who might be returned ancestors, survive, transformed and secularized in the modern Halloween. The mistletoe ceremony that the Roman writer Pliny describes, a druid in white robes climbing a sacred oak to cut mistletoe with a golden sickle, while white bulls were sacrificed below, is one of the most evocative images in all ancient descriptions of Celtic practice. The details may not be entirely accurate. Pliny was writing from secondary sources and had his own rhetorical purposes. But the core of the ceremony rings true with what archaeology and other sources confirm about Druidical practice. The mistletoe that grew on oak trees was a genuine rarity. The mistletoe that most people encounter in northern European hedgerows favors apple and poplar trees, and finding it on an oak was genuinely unusual, and its rarity made it precious as a symbol of the oak's special sacred character. The question of human sacrifice in Druidical ritual is one that modern discussions of the Druids cannot avoid, because it looms large in the ancient sources. Caesar and other Roman writers describe the Druids using large wicker structures in the shape of human beings, filled with living people and set alight. The accuracy of these descriptions has been debated by scholars for generations, with some arguing that they reflect genuine practice, and others arguing that they are hostile propaganda designed to justify Roman suppression of the Druids. The archaeological evidence from certain bog bodies, preserved corpses found in the wetlands of northern Europe, that show signs of elaborate ritual death, suggests that some form of ritual killing did occur in Celtic religious practice. The bog bodies from Tolland Fen in Denmark, Lindo Moss in England, and other sites were killed with a specificity and care that implies ritual purpose rather than simple execution or murder. One of the most persistent misconceptions about the Druids is the association with Stonehenge, the great prehistoric monument on Salisbury Plain in southern England that has been connected in popular imagination with Druidical practice since at least the 17th century. The connection is wrong, in the sense that Stonehenge was built approximately 2,000 years before any recognizable Druidical practice existed. It belongs to the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods, long before the Celtic cultures that supported the Druids had developed. But the persistence of the Stonehenge Druid association is not entirely without foundation, because the Druids did use existing prehistoric monuments as sacred sites, and the knowledge of astronomy and landscape that Stonehenge embodies was continuous with the kind of knowledge that Druidical practitioners maintained. The Coligny calendar, a fragmented bronze tablet found in 1897 near Coligny in eastern France, dating to approximately the 1st century CE, is the most important direct evidence we have of Druidical astronomical knowledge. The calendar, which is written in Gaulish using the Latin alphabet, is a lunisolar calendar of considerable sophistication, a system that coordinates the cycles of the moon and the sun into a coherent framework, allowing the accurate prediction of the seasons, the festivals, and the astronomical events that were of religious and practical importance. The mathematical knowledge required to construct such a calendar, to reconcile the incommensurable cycles of the solar year and the lunar month in a repeating pattern, was substantial, and the existence of the Coligny calendar demonstrates that the Druidical claim to expertise in astronomy was not mere mystification, but reflected genuine computational skill. The sacred springs and wells of the Celtic world were sites of Druidical practice that the archaeological record has documented in extraordinary detail. Across Britain, Ireland, Gaul, and the Celtic regions of Central Europe, excavations at springs and wells have recovered quantities of votive offerings, coins, jewelry, weapons, miniature implements, and occasionally human remains, that demonstrate the sustained religious use of these sites over centuries and sometimes millennia. The thermal springs at Bath in England, known to the Romans as Aquae Sulis, the waters of the goddess Sulis, were a major Druidical sacred site before Roman conquest, and the Roman temple complex that was built there after the conquest incorporated the existing cult of the local goddess Sulis into a Romano-Celtic religious practice that blended the two traditions. The healing properties attributed to sacred springs were not purely magical. Many of the springs associated with Druidical practice have genuinely unusual mineral content, iron, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, that could have real therapeutic effects on various conditions. The Druids who prescribed treatments at these springs may have been working with empirical knowledge of the spring's mineral properties, accumulated through generations of observation of which conditions responded well to which waters. The distinction between what we would call medical and spiritual treatment was not meaningful in the Druidical worldview. Illness was understood as a disruption of the relationship between the individual and the natural and divine world, and treatment involved restoring that relationship through both physical and spiritual means. The astronomical knowledge of the Druids extended beyond the calendar to the interpretation of celestial events for divinatory purposes. Ancient sources describe Druidical specialists who observed the stars, the moon, and natural phenomena for signs of coming events, a practice that was not mere superstition, but drew on long traditions of empirical observation of the correlations between natural events and seasonal patterns. The observation that certain astronomical configurations reliably preceded certain agricultural events, that the rising of particular star groups correlated with the arrival of specific seasons, that lunar phases correlated with patterns of weather and animal behavior, was genuine empirical knowledge, even if it was embedded in a theoretical framework that modern science would not recognize. The landscape itself was a sacred text for the Druids, a document written in the language of topography, hydrology, and vegetation that the trained observer could read for information about the spiritual character of places, the presence of divine forces, and the suitability of locations for various kinds of human activity. The Celtic understanding of ley lines, the lines of sacred connection between significant landscape features, may be largely a modern, romantic construction, but the underlying idea that landscape has spiritual character and that some places are more sacred than others reflects an ancient sensibility that the Druids certainly shared. The ability to identify and work with sacred places was part of the Druidical skill set, and the landscapes of Britain and Ireland are dotted with sites, springs, hilltops, ancient trees, stone circles, that carry the marks of Druidical recognition. The social functions of the Druidical order extended far beyond religious ritual into the practical domains of medicine, law, and political counsel, in ways that made Druids indispensable to the functioning of Celtic communities at every level. A Celtic tribe without Druids was a tribe without its legal system, without its medical practitioners, without its historical memory, and without its means of communicating with the divine forces on which all human well-being depended. This practical indispensability was the foundation of Druidical social power, and it was more durable than any military or political authority because it was continuously renewed by the genuine services that the Druids provided. Celtic medicine, as practiced by the Druidical order and by the specialist healers associated with it, was a sophisticated combination of plant-based pharmacology, ritual practice, and the therapeutic use of sacred sites. The Celtic Materia Medica, the catalogue of plants and their medical applications, was accumulated through centuries of empirical observation and was extensive enough to impress the Roman physicians who encountered it. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian, who was one of the most encyclopedic minds of the ancient world, incorporated information about Celtic plant lore into his natural history, clearly recognizing that Celtic practitioners knew things about the properties of plants that the Greco-Roman medical tradition had not documented. The Druidical judge, the Brytham in the Irish tradition, occupied a social position of enormous importance in a society that had no written law code and no professional legal class in the Roman sense. The Brytham was a specialist in the vast oral tradition of legal precedent and custom that governed every aspect of Celtic social life, from the rules of inheritance and marriage to the protocols of warfare and treaty-making. The ability to recall and apply these precedents correctly, to mediate between competing claims with the authority of both legal knowledge and divine sanction, and to enforce judgments through the threat of spiritual consequences, was the core of judicial Druidical practice. The power to impose spiritual excommunication, to exclude a person from religious ceremonies, and by extension, from the social fabric of the community, was the Druids' ultimate judicial instrument, and ancient sources describe it as more feared than physical punishment. A person excluded from Celtic religious life was effectively excluded from social life itself. They could not participate in the feasts, the assemblies, and the ceremonies that structured Celtic community, and other community members were expected to avoid contact with them. This social death was experienced as genuinely terrible in a culture where community membership was the foundation of meaningful existence, and the threat of its imposition was sufficient to bring most disputants into compliance with Druidical rulings. The prophetic function of the Druids, particularly of the specialist class of Vates or Ovates, who focused on divination, was exercised through multiple techniques. The interpretation of natural signs, such as the behavior of animals and the patterns of natural phenomena. The examination of sacrificial remains for information about divine intentions. Dreams and trances induced by specific techniques, and the observation of astronomical phenomena for their predictive significance. The Druidical diviner was not simply claiming supernatural insight. They were applying a systematic body of interpretive knowledge to observable phenomena and producing conclusions that, from within the Celtic worldview, were as rational and evidence-based as any other form of expert judgment. The role of Druids as political counselors to Celtic chieftains and kings was one of the most practically significant of their functions. Ancient sources describe Druids traveling with royal courts, advising on matters of policy and strategy, and playing crucial roles in the diplomatic negotiations between tribes. The access that the Druidical exemption from tribal violence provided, the ability to cross the boundaries between warring groups and communicate with all parties, made Druids invaluable as mediators in a world where intertribal communication was otherwise fraught with danger. The great annual assembly of the Druids of all Gaul in the territory of the Carnutes, the Gaulish tribe of the central Loire region, was not merely a religious gathering, but a political institution. The one occasion in the year when representatives of all Gaulish tribes could meet in a context of sacred neutrality and address matters of common concern. The institution of the great annual Druidical assembly, described by Caesar as drawing practitioners from all parts of Gaul to gather in the territory of the Carnutes, in the region of what is now the Loire Valley in central France, was one of the most extraordinary political institutions of the ancient world. And its existence tells us something important about the nature of Druidical authority and the scope of its reach. Here was an institution that operated across tribal boundaries, that commanded the participation of communities that might otherwise be at war with each other, that resolved disputes and established common standards of practice for an entire civilization. And it operated without any coercive military power, sustained entirely by the recognition of Druidical religious and intellectual authority. The presiding archdruid, the leader of the whole order, elected for life by his fellow Druids, was the closest thing the Celtic world had to a pan-ethnic religious leader. His authority was not based on military power or political appointment, but on the recognition of his peers that he possessed the deepest knowledge and the soundest judgment among all the Druids of Gaul. The election was contested when disputes arose about succession. Caesar describes one such dispute that nearly led to armed conflict, demonstrating that the institution was a living political reality with genuine stakes, rather than a purely ceremonial arrangement. The territory of the Carnutes was chosen as the location of the assembly for reasons that combined geography and sacred significance. The Carnutes occupied the region that the Gauls understood as the center of Gaul, a geographic symbolic position that made their territory the appropriate neutral ground for a gathering of the whole. The sacred groves in which the assembly was held were locations of long-established religious significance, places where the thin boundary between the human and divine worlds guaranteed that the proceedings were conducted under divine observation, and therefore in accordance with the standards of truth and justice that the divine world required. The functions of the assembly were multiple and practical. It was the occasion for the resolution of disputes that had not been resolved at the local or tribal level, cases that required the authority of the assembled order rather than any individual druid. It was the occasion for the transmission and standardization of druidical knowledge, the moment when practitioners from different regions could compare their learning, correct errors, and ensure that the oral tradition maintained its consistency across the vast geographic range of Celtic culture. It was a political forum at which the implications of the current military and diplomatic situation facing Gaul could be assessed by the people best positioned to understand both the immediate facts and the divine forces shaping the situation. And it was a social occasion for the renewal of the bonds between practitioners who otherwise worked in isolation in their own tribal territories. The power of druidical excommunication at the collective level, the ability of the assembled Druids to exclude an entire tribe or community from the religious life of the Celtic world, was a political instrument of considerable force. A tribe whose leadership was judged to have violated the sacred obligations of Celtic civilization could be collectively excluded. Its members were denied the protection of sacred neutrality when they traveled. Its chieftain lost the divine sanction that legitimized his rule, and the community as a whole suffered the spiritual consequences of collective separation from the divine order. This collective excommunication was the most powerful non-military instrument of political coercion available in the Celtic world, and the threat of its application shaped political behavior across the entire range of Celtic civilization. The relationship between the assembly of Druids and the political crises that would eventually lead to the destruction of Gaulish independence under Caesar is a subject of considerable interest and some speculation. It is clear that the Druids were aware of the Roman threat from an early stage. They had information networks that reached across the Celtic world, and the Roman expansion in southern Gaul from the late 2nd century BCE onward was visible to any politically aware observer. Whether the assembly played a role in organizing resistance, in coordinating the responses of different Gaulish tribes to the Roman threat, or in attempting to negotiate some accommodation with Rome, is unclear from the surviving sources. What is clear is that Caesar identified the Druids as a significant element in the organization of Gaulish resistance, and that the suppression of the Druids was a deliberate strategic objective of Roman policy in Gaul. The Druids' role in Celtic warfare was not that of combatants. They were specifically exempt from military service, and the ancient sources are consistent in presenting them as non-fighting specialists who accompanied armies in advisory and ritual capacities. But their function in the context of warfare was nonetheless significant and, from the Celtic perspective, potentially decisive. They were the people who could read the omens that told whether a proposed battle would end in victory or defeat, who could call down divine favor on Celtic forces or divine punishment on their enemies, and whose presence on the battlefield was understood to affect the spiritual balance of the conflict in ways that might matter as much as the physical disposition of troops. The battle curse, the Druidical pronouncement of divine condemnation against an enemy force, was a ritual act conducted in full view of both armies, and its effect was psychological as much as theological. A warrior who genuinely believed that the divine world had been invoked against him, that the sacred powers of the natural world had been directed against his enterprise, was a warrior who might fight less effectively regardless of his physical courage. The psychological dimension of Druidical battle magic was understood by both the Celts and their opponents. Roman sources describe Gaulish warriors as genuinely affected by the sight of Druidical cursing ceremonies, and the famous episode of the Roman attack on Anglesey, where the soldiers initially froze at the sight of the Druids and their attendant women, speaks to the psychological force of Druidical theatrical presence. The role of Druids in interpreting omens before battles was a practical function that influenced military decision-making in concrete ways. The Celtic practice of examining the entrails of sacrificed animals for signs of divine intention, and of making military decisions based on these readings, was not mere superstition in the context of Celtic military culture. The Druids who conducted these examinations were specialists in reading a complex system of signs that had accumulated centuries of interpretive tradition. Their readings were not random. They drew on a body of accumulated experience about the correlations between natural observations and the outcomes of military engagements that, embedded in a theological framework, functioned as a form of systematic pattern recognition. The Gaulish carnix, the great war trumpet, whose animal-headed bell projected a harsh, inhuman sound across the battlefield, was operated by specialists who were closely associated with the Druidical order. The carnix was not simply a signaling instrument, but a ritual one. Its sound was understood as the voice of the divine world, channeled through the bronze body of the instrument to shake the confidence of enemies and inspire the courage of warriors. The acoustics of the carnix, which has a distinctive, harsh, buzzing timbre, quite unlike any other ancient instrument, were selected for maximum psychological impact, and the combined effect of multiple carnix played simultaneously, along with the war cries of Celtic warriors and the visual spectacle of lateen, decorated armor and weapons, constituted a deliberate system of psychological warfare in which the Druids were the principal architects. The prophetic pronouncements of Druids before and during military campaigns were taken seriously enough by Celtic leaders to influence strategic decisions. The ancient sources describe several instances in which Celtic military operations were altered or abandoned because Druidical reading of omens indicated unfavorable outcomes. This was not simply credulity. A chieftain who ignored Druidical warnings risked the demoralization of his warriors, who were watching the omens as carefully as their leaders. The Druidical oracle was embedded in a system of collective belief that made its pronouncements practically significant, regardless of their literal validity. The most famous encounter between Roman soldiers and Druidical warriors, the attack on Anglesey in 60 CE under the governor Suetonius Paulinus, is described by the Roman historian Tacitus with a vividness that suggests genuine historical memory. Tacitus describes the Druids standing among the warriors on the shore, raising their hands to the sky and calling down curses on the invaders. Black-robed women ran between them, carrying torches and behaving in ways that Tacitus describes as resembling the furies of Roman mythology. The Roman soldiers, he says, were struck with a superstitious fear, momentarily frozen by the sight, before discipline reasserted itself and they charged. The grove on Anglesey was destroyed, and the Druids who had gathered there were killed. It was the last significant concentration of Druidical learning in the Roman-controlled world. The Greek and Roman writers who described the Druids were not uniformly hostile, and some of the most interesting ancient testimony about the Druids comes from philosophers and intellectuals who were genuinely impressed by what they had learned about Druidical thought. The comparison between Druidical philosophy and the teachings of Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher who had also taught the transmigration of souls and the importance of mathematical harmony in the natural world, appears in multiple ancient sources, and while scholars debate whether the comparison reflects actual historical influence or simply parallel development, it demonstrates that ancient intellectuals recognized the Druids as participants in the same broad philosophical conversation that occupied the best minds of the Mediterranean world. Posidonius of Apamea, the Stoic philosopher and historian who traveled extensively in the Celtic world in the early 1st century BCE, and whose account of the Druids was probably the most informed and detailed of the ancient descriptions, clearly found the Druids intellectually interesting rather than simply exotic. His description of Druidical philosophical discussions, conducted at feasts, where the challenge of maintaining intellectual dignity in the context of competitive drinking was itself a kind of philosophical exercise, suggests a tradition of discourse that had its own conventions and its own high standards. The Druidical doctrine of the soul's immortality was not simply a consoling belief, but a philosophical position with specific content. The soul, in the Druidical teaching, was not destroyed by death, but underwent a process of transition, passing from one body to another in a sequence of lives that constituted a kind of education, a progressive refinement through experience. The ultimate goal of this process, what it was moving toward, is not clearly stated in the surviving ancient sources, but the analogy with Pythagorean and Platonic ideas about the soul's journey toward a final liberation from the cycle of rebirth suggests that the Druids may have held similar views about a final destination beyond the cycle of transmigration. The bardic tradition, the work of the specialist class of poets who preserved the community's collective memory and transmitted it through composed verse, was the intellectual tradition most directly accessible to non-specialists, because bards performed publicly in ways that the more esoteric Druidical learning did not. The poems of the bards were entertainment, historical record, social commentary, and moral instruction simultaneously, and their performance at feasts and assemblies gave them a wide and attentive audience. The formal requirements of bardic composition were demanding. Specific meters, required allusions, prescribed formulas, and elaborate conventions of praise and blame governed every kind of bardic output. A bard who composed incorrectly, or who praised when condemnation was called for and condemned when praise was due, was failing in both an artistic and a moral sense. The Druidical understanding of time was cyclical rather than linear. Time moved in great circles, returning to its starting points through the regular cycles of the seasons, the years, and the larger astronomical periods that Druidical astronomy tracked. This cyclical view of time was not merely a philosophical position, but a practical framework for understanding human affairs. Events recurred in recognizable patterns. The past provided templates for understanding the present, and the future could be read in the signs left by the turning of the great cycles. The Druid who had studied these cycles for 20 years possessed, in the Druidical view, a genuine advantage in understanding the present and anticipating the future. Not through supernatural powers, but through the deep familiarity with pattern and cycle that extensive study made possible. The historical record of the Druids is thin enough that individual named Druids are rare. Most of what we know about the order concerns its collective practices and social functions, rather than the specific lives of individual practitioners. But a few names have come down to us with enough historical context to be treated as real people rather than legendary figures, and their stories illuminate the Druidical tradition from the inside in ways that the more general descriptions cannot. Diviciacus was a Druid of the Aedui tribe of central Gaul, the same tribe that had maintained its alliance with Rome and that would provide Caesar with crucial support during the Gallic Wars. He is the only Druid known to us by name who appears in Roman historical sources as a genuine political actor rather than a purely symbolic figure. And his story is remarkable precisely because it shows a Druid operating at the intersection of Celtic and Roman worlds, with a sophistication that belies the primitive barbarian stereotype that Roman writers sometimes applied to Celtic practitioners. Diviciacus travelled to Rome in approximately 61 BCE, several years before Caesar's campaigns began, as an ambassador seeking Roman military support for the Aedui against their rivals the Sequani and their Helvetian and Germanic allies. He appears in the writings of Cicero, the greatest Roman orator and intellectual of the period, who describes meeting him and being impressed by his knowledge of augury, the Roman art of divination, which Cicero says Diviciacus claimed to practice as well. The fact that a Gaulish Druid and Rome's greatest intellectual could discuss divination as a shared interest, with mutual recognition of each other's expertise, is a reminder of the genuine intellectual exchange that occurred between the Roman and Celtic worlds, even in the period of conquest. Caesar himself knew Diviciacus personally. His brother Dumnorix was one of the key figures in Gaulish resistance to Roman power, and the relationship between the two brothers, one working with Rome and one against it, adds human complexity to the political drama of the Gallic Wars. Caesar's decision to spare Dumnorix's life on multiple occasions, despite Dumnorix's active opposition to Roman interests, was partly a concession to Diviciacus's value as an ally and interpreter. Diviciacus is presented in Caesar's account as a man of genuine intelligence and political skill, a Druid functioning as a diplomat, intelligence officer, and political advisor in a world being torn apart by the conflict between Celtic independence and Roman expansion. The figure of Merlin, the wizard of the Arthurian legends, is one of the most interesting examples of the long afterlife of Druidical figures in Western cultural imagination. The earliest Welsh sources for the Merlin character, particularly the works attributed to Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, draw on a tradition of the prophetic poet-wizard that is continuous with the Druidical bard tradition of earlier Celtic culture. The Merlin of the later Arthurian tradition, with his knowledge of the natural world, his prophetic powers, his connection to the landscape of Britain, and his role as advisor to kings, is essentially a Christianized Druid, a figure who retained the functions and the cultural authority of the Druidical tradition while being embedded in the new Christian cultural framework. The archaeological evidence for individual Druids is inevitably fragmentary, since the Druids left no written records and their burial customs are not always easily distinguished from those of other high-status individuals. But certain burials, particularly those that include unusual combinations of objects, medical instruments, or the remains of the kinds of sacred plants associated with Druidical practice, have been tentatively identified as those of Druidical practitioners. The Colchester burial from Roman period Britain, containing a set of medical instruments, divination rods, and imported Roman wine and food, alongside locally made objects in Celtic style, has been interpreted as the burial of a practitioner who combined Roman and Celtic intellectual traditions, a figure navigating the cultural boundaries of a conquered world. The Roman decision to suppress the Druids was not made in a moment of cultural misunderstanding or military accident. It was a deliberate, strategic policy, implemented consistently over several decades by multiple emperors, and it reflected a clear-eyed Roman understanding of what the Druids were and why they were dangerous. The Roman sources that describe the suppression, Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, are not uniformly in agreement about the methods or the timing, but they are unanimous in presenting it as a policy decision rather than a spontaneous reaction, and in understanding the Druids as the organizational center of Celtic resistance to Roman authority. The Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, and who presided over the consolidation of Roman power in Gaul following Caesar's conquest, issued decrees restricting Druidical practice, specifically the aspects of Druidical religion that involved human sacrifice, or what the Romans interpreted as human sacrifice. The focus on human sacrifice as the justification for suppression was not accidental. It allowed Rome to frame the persecution of the Druids as a moral crusade against barbaric practices, rather than as the political suppression of an inconvenient intellectual class. Whatever the actual nature of Celtic sacrificial practice, the Roman framing ensured that Druidical suppression could be presented as civilizational progress rather than naked political repression. The Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus and reigned from 14 to 37 CE, extended the suppression to include the Druidical order as a whole, not just specific practices, but the institution itself. The Druids of Gaul found themselves declared illegal. Their assemblies were prohibited. Their functions as judges and councillors were transferred to Roman legal institutions, and the practice of Druidical religion was made a criminal offence for Roman citizens. The effect on the Druidical order in Gaul was severe, though it was not immediate or complete. A tradition maintained through oral transmission and personal apprenticeship was harder to suppress than one that could be shut down by closing temples or burning books. The concentration of surviving Druids in Britain, and particularly on the island of Anglesey, the Holy Island at the northwestern tip of Wales, reflected the refuge that unconquered or recently conquered territory offered to practitioners whose work had been banned in the more thoroughly Romanized parts of the Celtic world. Anglesey had been a Druidical centre before the Roman conquest of Britain. Its location at the far western edge of the known world, surrounded by water that marked the boundary between the human world and the supernatural, gave it a sacred character that the Druidical tradition associated with particularly intense divine presence. It became the last refuge of a tradition that was being systematically eliminated elsewhere. The destruction of Anglesey in 60 CE by Suetonius Paulinus was thus not simply a military operation against a resistant island population. It was a deliberate act of cultural extinction, an attempt to destroy the last institutional centre of the Druidical tradition in the Roman-controlled world. The groves on Anglesey were burned. The Druids who had gathered there, having fled from Gaul, from other parts of Britain, from wherever Roman suppression had made their practice impossible, were killed. The oral tradition they carried was lost with them. 20-year educations, representing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, terminated in an afternoon. The survival of Druidical practice in Ireland, the one significant portion of the Celtic world that Rome never conquered, depended partly on the development of communication and record-keeping systems that could preserve knowledge without creating the kind of readable text that could be seized and destroyed by hostile authorities. The Ogham script, a writing system using arrangements of notches cut along the edge of a stone or piece of wood, apparently derived from a system of hand signals, developed in Ireland in the early centuries of the Common Era, and served as the primary medium for inscribed text in the Irish Celtic world for several centuries. The Ogham script was not primarily a literary medium. The texts preserved in Ogham are mostly memorial inscriptions, names and genealogies carved on standing stones. But the tradition that Ogham had Druidical origins, that it was a system specifically designed for communication among initiates who shared the knowledge of its interpretation, reflects a real understanding of the script's relationship to specialized knowledge. A system of notches along an edge is invisible to the casual observer, legible only to someone who knows what to look for. A genuinely cryptic medium that could serve exactly the communication purposes that a suppressed intellectual tradition would require. The networks of Druidical practice that continued in Ireland after the suppression of the tradition in Roman-controlled territory were sustained by the same institutional mechanisms that had always maintained the tradition. The long apprenticeship, the oral transmission of knowledge, the movement of practitioners between communities. The Irish Druids of the early centuries of the Common Era, who appear in the early Irish literary sources as Fili, the poet-seers, who occupied a social role continuous with the Druidical tradition even as it was being Christianized, maintained connections with practitioners in Britain and possibly with the remnants of the Gaulish tradition through the networks of trade, kinship, and shared religious practice that connected the Celtic world. The intelligence function of the bardic network, the use of traveling poets and musicians as carriers of information between communities, was a well-established feature of Celtic culture that the specifically Druidical practitioners could exploit for more sensitive information. A bard traveling between chieftains' halls was expected to carry news, poetry, and entertainment. The same journey that served these cultural functions could also carry information about military movements, political arrangements, and the activities of communities that the Druidical network needed to monitor for the purpose of maintaining its own coherence and responding to external threats. The magical reputation of the Druids, their alleged ability to transform themselves and others, to create illusions, to control natural phenomena, was maintained and elaborated in the Irish literary tradition, even as the historical Druidical order was being absorbed into the new Christian intellectual framework. Irish literature are figures of enormous power, capable of raising fogs, calling down storms, creating entire armies. And while these accounts are clearly legendary rather than historical, they preserve a memory of the social power that the historical Druids had exercised through their mastery of spectacle, their control of information, and manipulate the beliefs and expectations of their communities. The encounter between Christianity and the Druidical tradition in Celtic fringe was not the simple victory of a new religion over an old one. It was a prolonged and complex negotiation, sometimes surprisingly accommodating, in which the new faith absorbed significant elements of the tradition it was displacing and ways of surviving within the new cultural framework. The result was the Celtic Christianity that produced the scripts, the distinctive monastic culture, and the missionary tradition that carried Irish learning back into a post-Roman much of its own classical heritage. The Irish missionaries of the 5th and 6th centuries, Patrick, Brigid, were not simply carriers of a Roman Christianity imported from the Mediterranean world. They were products of an Irish already absorbed and transformed the classical Christian tradition through its encounter with the indigenous Irish intellectual framework they practiced and transmitted, had distinctive features that reflected this cultural synthesis. The Irish monastic natural world as a site of divine presence, its practice of praying outdoors, its sensitivity to the spiritual character shapes, its sense of the sacred as immanent in the natural world, echoes the Druidical worldview in ways that suggest continuity rather than simple replacement. The figures of Brigid and Patrick, the two most important saints of the early, both show traces of Druidical antecedents. Patrick's account of his own spiritual journey, which involves years with the natural world in the hills of Western Ireland, has a quality of Druidical initiation about it. Kildare, where a sacred fire was kept burning continuously, was built on a site of pre-Christian sacred significance and the goddess tradition that the Druidical order had maintained. The early Irish Church was not naive about these continuities, deliberately using the familiar elements of the older tradition to make the new faith accessible to communities whose spiritual imagination is centuries of Druidical practice. The tension between Druidical practitioners and Christian missionaries in early Ireland was the literary sources that describe it tend to frame it as miraculous contests between holy men, rather than as sociological institutional authority. The Fili, the poet-seers who occupied the social role that had been the Druids in the world, maintained their functions as judges, historians, and keepers of collective memory well into the Christian times in explicit competition with the new ecclesiastical authority for control of these functions. The eventual synthesis The process by which the Druids disappeared from European history was not sudden. It was a gradual transformation over several centuries, in which the specific institutional form of the Druidical order was dissolved by the combined pressures of Roman suppression, Christian conversion, and the collapse of the Celtic social structures that had supported it, while the functions the Druids had performed survived in modified forms within the new cultural frameworks of post-Roman and early medieval Europe. In Gaul, The Druidical order was suppressed most thoroughly and most early, and the transformation was correspondingly complete. The Roman provincial civilization that replaced Celtic tribal organization in Gaul had its own specialists for all the functions the Druids had performed. Roman law replaced Druidical law. Roman medicine replaced Druidical medicine. Roman augury replaced Druidical divination, and the Catholic Church replaced Druidical religion. The Gaulish elite that survived the conquest and Romanization found their path to status and influence through Roman institutions, and the Druidical learning that had been one of the primary routes to high status in Celtic society was replaced by Roman legal and rhetorical education as the mark of the cultivated person. In Britain, the process was slower and less complete. The Roman occupation of Britain was never as thorough as that of Gaul. The north of Britain was never effectively Romanized, and even the southern and eastern regions that came most fully under Roman administrative control maintained elements of Celtic practice beneath the Roman surface. The withdrawal of Roman administration in the early 5th century CE opened space for the reassertion of Celtic cultural forms, and the Anglo-Saxon migrations that followed the Roman withdrawal created a different kind of cultural pressure. Not Romanization, but Germanization, that pushed the British Celts toward the west and north and into closer contact with their Irish cousins. The gradual loss of Druidical institutional complexity in Ireland, as the Fili absorbed the functions of the Druids within a Christian intellectual framework, was the most benign version of the Druids' disappearance. Here, the knowledge was preserved, even if the institution was transformed. Brehon law system that survived in Ireland into the 17th century was a direct continuation of the oral legal tradition that the Druids had maintained, transmitted through the specialist legal families who had preserved it across the centuries of Christian Ireland. The bardic schools of medieval Ireland, the institutions in which professional poets were trained in the demanding conventions of Irish verse, were the direct institutional descendants of the Druidical schools that Caesar had described, maintaining the tradition of long oral memorization and systematic learning in a Christian context. The village wise man or woman, the local practitioner of herbal medicine, divination, and the management of supernatural forces, who appears in the folklore of Ireland, Britain, Wales, and Brittany throughout the medieval and early modern period, represents the most diffuse and most enduring form of the Druidical tradition's survival. These figures, who might be consulted for healing, for the resolution of disputes, for protection against malevolent supernatural forces, or for guidance about the spiritual character of local landscapes, were operating within a folk tradition that preserved, in simplified and partially Christianized form, elements of the Druidical knowledge that had been transmitted from community to community since before the Roman conquest. The Druids of early medieval Ireland and Scotland existed in a world where the clear institutional boundaries of the historical Druidical order had already been dissolved by the encounter with Christianity, and where the knowledge and functions of the old order were being distributed among several different categories of specialist. The Fili, or poets-seers, who maintained the literary and prophetic traditions, the Brehons, who maintained the legal tradition, the physicians, who maintained the medical knowledge, and the ecclesiastical clergy, who were increasingly absorbing all of these functions into the new Christian institutional framework. The Fili of early medieval Ireland occupied a social position of remarkable power and prestige in a society that was simultaneously Christianizing and maintaining strong continuities with its pre-Christian past. The Fili were poets in the full Celtic sense, not merely entertainers, but keepers of the community's historical memory, judges of social worth through their power of praise and blame, and practitioners of a craft whose technical requirements were so demanding that they required years of specialized training. The bardic schools in which Fili were trained maintained the tradition of oral memorization and technical expertise that went back to the Druidical schools of the pre-Christian period. And the knowledge preserved in these schools included not just literary and poetic knowledge, but elements of the mythological, legal, and cosmological learning that had been the Druids' domain. The Columban monasteries that spread from Ireland across Britain and into the European continent in the 6th and 7th centuries CE were the vehicles through which Irish learning, including the elements of Druidical knowledge that had been absorbed into Irish Christian culture, was transmitted back to a post-Roman Europe that had lost much of its own classical heritage. The monks of Iona, Lindisfarne, Bobbio, and Sangol were preserving and transmitting a cultural heritage that was simultaneously Christian and Celtic, Mediterranean and insular, and their manuscripts, the great illuminated books of the early medieval period, are the physical embodiments of this cultural synthesis. The last clearly identifiable Druids in the historical record are figures from the early Irish literary tradition, practitioners who appear in the stories and annals of the 5th through 7th centuries as opponents of the Christian missionaries, as keepers of the old ways in communities that had not yet converted, or as characters whose Druidical identity is maintained even as their functions are absorbed into the new order. By the 8th century CE, the word Druid had become primarily a literary and historical term in Ireland, something that referred to figures from the mythological past rather than to living practitioners. The institution was gone. Its knowledge, transformed and dispersed, lived on. The oral tradition that the Druids had maintained for over a millennium, the vast body of knowledge about the natural world, the divine world, the history of the Celtic peoples, and the principles of just social organization, was not entirely lost. It was transformed, preserved in the bardic tradition, encoded in the legal texts of the Brehon tradition, embedded in the mythological narratives of the Irish literary cycle, and carried into Christian practice in the distinctive sensibilities of the Celtic Church. The loss was real. Much was lost, particularly the more esoteric dimensions of Druidical cosmology and the specific techniques of divination and ritual that required living transmission to be meaningful. But the survival was also real, and the cultural tradition that emerged from the encounter between Druidical culture and Christianity was richer for the encounter than either tradition would have been in isolation. The Druids disappeared as a historical institution around the 8th century CE. They reappeared in a quite different form in the 18th century, when a group of British intellectuals, inspired by a mixture of genuine classical scholarship, romantic longing for a pre-industrial past, and creative imagination, began to construct what they called a revival of Druidical practice. The neo-Druidism that emerged from this 18th century reconstruction, and that has continued developing ever since, is not the historical Druidical order reborn. It is a modern spiritual movement that uses the idea of the Druids as a framework for exploring relationships with nature, community, and the inner life. But its existence tells us something important about the enduring power of the Druidical idea. The association of neo-Druidism with Stonehenge, the prehistoric monument on Salisbury Plain that the 18th century antiquarian John Aubrey connected with the Druids in the 1600s, is historically incorrect, as we noted in an earlier episode. Stonehenge was built 2,000 years before any recognizable Druidical practice existed, but the connection has proven remarkably durable, and the gatherings of modern Druids at Stonehenge for the summer and winter solstices have become a permanent feature of the British cultural calendar. Every year, as the sun rises over the Heelstone at the summer solstice, people in white robes and elaborate Celtic-inspired costume gather in the circle of prehistoric stones and perform ceremonies that combine elements of genuine archaeological knowledge, imaginative reconstruction, and contemporary spiritual practice. The Romantic revival of Celticism in the 18th and 19th centuries, which included not just Neo-Druidism, but the Welsh Eisteddfod tradition, the Ossian poems of James Macpherson, and the broader Celtic revival in literature and visual art, drew on and amplified the popular fascination with the Druids as representatives of a lost wisdom tradition. The Druid of Romantic imagination was a figure of noble simplicity, in harmony with nature, possessed of a profound philosophical understanding that the industrializing modern world had lost. This image had almost nothing to do with the historical Druids, but it served important cultural functions. It provided a usable past for nations seeking to construct a pre-Roman, pre-English identity, and it articulated a critique of industrial modernity in terms that the past seemed to validate. The sites that the historical Druids used, Newgrange in Ireland, Carnac in Brittany, the Avebury complex, and Maiden Castle in England, are among the most visited archaeological sites in Europe, and their continued fascination speaks to something deeper than mere historical curiosity. Newgrange, the great passage tomb in the Boyne Valley of Ireland, that was built around 3200 BCE, predating Stonehenge, and that is aligned so precisely with the winter solstice sunrise that for a few minutes on the shortest day of the year, a shaft of sunlight penetrates the passage and illuminates the inner chamber, is not a Druidical monument. But it is a monument built by the ancestors of the people whose descendants became the Celts, and it embodies the same sensitivity to the relationship between astronomical time and sacred space that the Druidical calendar and the Druidical sacred sites expressed. The Druids' influence on popular culture is pervasive and largely unacknowledged. The wizard figure, in the Arthurian tradition as Merlin, in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as Gandalf, in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter universe as Dumbledore, is a recognizable type whose characteristics draw directly on the Druidical model. The long white beard, the deep knowledge of the natural world, the prophetic powers, the role as advisor to kings and heroes, the mysterious connection to forces that others cannot perceive. These fictional wizards are not Druids in costume, but they draw on a cultural memory of the Druidical figure that has been transmitted through the bardic and literary traditions of the Celtic world and its successors for 2,000 years. The Druids kept no written records, built no lasting monuments, and left no direct institutional successors. And yet, here we are, still talking about them. The oak grove is long gone. The sacred fires of the great festivals have been unlit for over 1,000 years in the places where they burned brightest. The 20-year educations that produced the greatest minds of the Celtic world came to an end somewhere in the 7th or 8th century CE, and the vast oral archive they maintained was only partially saved by the monastic scribes who wrote down fragments of it before it disappeared entirely. We know less about the Druids than about almost any other major intellectual tradition in human history. And yet, we cannot stop thinking about them. That persistent fascination is itself a kind of testimony. The recognition, barely conscious but persistent, that something real was lost when the last groves were burned and the last voices fell silent, and that the world has been a little more impoverished for the loss ever since. The oak grove is long gone, but the knowledge that it sheltered has found other homes, and it persists.